Hello, everyone. It is so nice to see everyone back for another one of these Saturday webinars. As I'm sure all of you are aware, things have been a little difficult over here in the UK this week. So I wanted first of all to mention and pay tribute to Her Majesty the Queen, who we unfortunately lost on Thursday. And yeah, please accept the sympathies of UniAdmissions and me, and I'm sure James personally as well on that. Certainly, it's been a difficult couple of days for me. It's a lot losing a family member. But the show must go on. James, how are you today?
Oh, yes, I'm good. Obviously, it's kind of a little bit of a bit sad, isn't it? But yeah, I think there's not much more to say on that. But yeah, I'm okay. I'm good. Yeah, looking forward to some possibly some more interesting trivia from you this week.
Well, I say the main trivia I've noticed is I've just been thinking of all those poor people who are going to have to change all those signs. Everything that says Her Majesty, they have to update to His Majesty. It's going to be going to be a small fortune in little stickers. So we've already had one question come in. Someone has asked if a recording is going to be available. Yes, recordings of our webinars are available on the main UniAdmissions website, normally Wednesday or Thursday, depending on how complicated it is to edit. I try not to make it too complicated, but sometimes I don't succeed. So you'll be able to pick those up there, and there is an archive of loads. I think quite possibly close to 100 of these now that you can watch. So if you come out of this in 40-50 minutes feeling as though you would like more, there is an awful lot more available if that's what you would like. I can't say I recommend it personally, but tastes do vary. So as hopefully you're aware, we're going to be talking this week about the Ucat, the test for getting into medical school. It's the one that's not the BMAT. And talking through, as I believe pretty much everyone should have their Ucat results now. I think the sitting window is over, right, James?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe it's now kind of decision-making time or coming up to it, certainly, for the UCAS applications and the university choices, the medical school choices. Yeah,
so that's what we're going to be focusing on today, talking through a little bit of the options that your UCAT score opens up. And so this is going to be a little bit speculative. We can have a few graphs, but I think it's going to be helpful. And then next week, we're going to be moving slightly sideways from medicine, and we're going to be talking about some really challenging Oxford and Cambridge interview questions, which we're going to be trying out. I'm hopeful that I'm going to get Rohan or Will or really any willing victim, as we're going to be doing a series of sort of live mock interviews almost. So I think that's going to be really exciting to tune in for. It's something I'm looking forward to, unless I'm answering the questions, in which case I'm not looking forward to it.
I think I'm busy those weekends, Matt. Conveniently, yeah.
Very, very strategic of you. Unfortunately, I'm here every week, whether I like it or not. So if you would like to see me look foolish, then that opportunity will be there next week. We're going to be talking first, just very quickly, through how the scoring of the Ucat works, which hopefully will be familiar to most of you. We'll be then going on to talk about what your score means, how we can put it in context, and then we're looking at some of the options for if your Ucat score was not quite as high as you had hoped. So making sure that we have a sense of what options there are there. No, I didn't want those slides. Don't know what they're doing here. The Ucat, as I'm sure you know, it's the Ucat, the University Clinical Aptitude Test. It's required for a whole range of the top medical schools in the country. It took you 2 hours, hopefully. And it is a computer-based exam. So each version of the exam is different from each other version of the exam. So you won't have been given exactly the same questions as the person sitting next to you. And that goes for all of the sections of the exam, whether that's the verbal reasoning, the decision-making, the quantitative reasoning, the abstract reasoning, and the situational judgment sections. And this is a contrast with the BMAT, which many of you will be coming to sit in the next few weeks. As the UCAT is much more abstract, it doesn't have the scientific section that you get in the BMAT. It doesn't have the essay section either. And so we find that although performance in the UCAT is correlated with performance in the BMAT, there are plenty of students who do much better on one than on the other. And so if you have had a difficult experience with the UCAT, that isn't indicative of whether you will have the similar problems with the BMAT. Bear in mind that only 2 sections are shared between the 2 exams. And so depending on your scores, and this is something we'll probably have a look at as we're going through the presentation today. If you found that you have scored better in the parts of the UCAT that overlap with the BMAT, then it may be worth putting a little bit more emphasis on the BMAT when you're making your choices in the next 4 or 5 weeks. So the UCAT scoring. So the UCAT, like the BMAT, has a scaled scoring system. So the number of correct answers you get in each of the sections, I think it's 44 questions in the first section, that is converted to a score between 0 and 900, rather than you being given the score out of 44. So if you get 44 out of 44, presumably that means you get 900. If you get nothing out of 44, which would be very skillful on a multiple choice exam, well done. That's not supposed to be possible. Then you would get 0, and so on and so forth, up and down. Now, I've never totally understood why the BMAT does this kind of scale scoring, because the BMAT, everyone gets the same questions. There's really no need for it. The UCAT, because no 2 applicants sit identical tests, because you're going to have a subtly different set of questions from each other person. Even if you end up with a lot of similar questions, they may be coming in different order. You need to apply the scale scoring to make sure that no one is disadvantaged by getting harder questions. So the way you do this, and it's fairly complicated from a mathematical standpoint. It's I think the Bonifuri coefficient. It takes a while, but basically what you do is you look at each question, and you would expect that if people were guessing, then that each of the answers would be equally likely to come up. And then you were able to, based on that, look at how hard or difficult each question was based on the share of people who got it right, compared to what you would expect if they were just guessing. So if you have a question that people are getting, let's say a question with 5 possible answers, but people only get the right answer 20% of the time, what you're seeing there is that question must be really hard because people are doing no better than they would by guessing at answering it. Whereas if people are getting the correct answer 80% of the time, you can see that that question must be relatively easy compared with the question that people are only getting right 20% of the time. Does that make sense, James? I appreciate this is a little complicated.
I mean, yes, it does. It does make sense, yeah.
And so the advantage of this kind of score scaling is it allows you to compensate for that. So if it turns out that some of the questions are unusually difficult, it means you get a little bit more credit for doing well on those. And if those questions are particularly difficult, you also are at less of a disadvantage for having got them wrong. As I say, the maths of it is dreadfully complicated, but it does have the great advantage of making sure that it is really a very thoroughly fair test, and that's something that is sort of nice about the UCAT. It is, in that respect, a little bit more thorough than the BMAT, as well as not testing you based on scientific knowledge, having all those shapes in there, which I'm not sure I could revise for those if I tried. I can't bear the shapes around. So what we see then is if you look at the results that this scoring system produces, you get this lovely smooth curve. So once the scaling is applied, rather than having what you would expect to happen here, which would be a quite lumpy sort of graph, as you see how each year the test gets harder or easier, and so students are getting higher marks or lower marks. Because everything is smoothed out through this scaling process, you get this really lovely smooth line for the last 3 or 4 years of the UCAT, showing you that the average score goes up really quite smoothly along with your placement compared with other students. So the very best students are getting up around the 2800 mark. The students who are performing least well are getting around 2150. And you see this really smooth transition. We haven't got any graphs of the BMAT in today, but what you'll see is that the BMAT has something that looks much more like a bell curve, which means that at certain points, extra correct answers are making a really big difference in the BMAT, whereas they make a smaller difference in the UCAT. When I was putting this together, I didn't realize how technical this was going to be this week. So if you're not enjoying it, my apologies. This is what happens when they let me talk about how the tests actually work. What you'll also see is that the relationship year on year between student scores is also really strong. So as again, unlike with a test like the BMAT, you don't get years where students are finding it much harder or much easier. What you see is the score scaling stays really close together right through the marks, so that you have only a difference of maybe 30 or 40 points between the best students in one year and the best students in another, based on the difficulty of the test. And then this all again is a kind of an interesting artifact of test design, which is something I'm personally interested in, but I shouldn't imagine anyone else is. So that's how the UCAT scoring works. Sort of the takeaway there should be that it is designed to make sure that it is a really fair test, that you get good credit for, you get real credit for getting the right answers, especially if the answers are if the questions turn out to be difficult, and also you get this really smooth distribution. So what you won't find is enormous differences in score based on only 2 or 3 correct answers, which is what we're going to be talking about when it comes to the BMAT, which we'll probably be revisiting in the next couple of weeks. So stick around for that if you're looking forward to that. So the thing to bear in mind here is that your decile, that is to say how many students there were above and below you in kind of the ranking, is much more important than your score. Although the scores themselves don't change much year on year, as we've seen, there's no such thing as a good or a bad UCAT score. It's all about how your score compares with other students. The next thing to say is don't worry too much if there's quite a big gap between your section scores. What we find is that some students, like me, find the abstract reasoning unbearable. I have done the UCAT a couple of times, sort of for fun and as part of my preparation for these presentations, and I can score barely above random at the abstract reasoning section. I'm about as good as just putting the answer down as A every time, which is quicker. I find that section, my brain cannot do it. Other people, however, they look at that section and they go, well, this is obvious. And they blaze through it in 5 or 6 minutes. Meanwhile, I'm very good at the quantitative reasoning, getting all of the words to turn into numbers. That section I find fairly easy, and I can normally get fairly close to full marks on that. Obviously, this isn't especially helpful because I'm not applying for medical school because I'm 33 years old. And so the test isn't really supposed to work on me. But it does just go to show that the gaps between your performance in the different segments can be fairly substantial, and that's not weird or a problem. So if we look here, for example, at the distribution of section scores between the deciles, what you'll see is that right across the distribution, students find the verbal reasoning section of the UCAT the hardest, and they find the quantitative reasoning section the easiest. And that the gap between those scores can be really, really quite big. You'll see there that an average student, that a student at the very top end of the range is getting pretty much 100% out of the quantitative reasoning section, getting a score of around 800, but they could be scoring as many as 120, 130, 140 points lower on the verbal reasoning section. Now, these are, of course, averages. So there are some students who are brilliant at everything, and there are some students who are dreadful at everything. What we notice is that in general, students sitting the UCAT find the verbal reasoning section much harder than the quantitative reasoning section. And interestingly, this is where I differ. They do fairly well on the abstract reasoning, which I just cannot do. The other thing to note here is if we look at the incline of these graphs, what you'll notice is that the variation in the situational judgment test is somewhat lower than for the other sections, and so it's worth bearing in mind that the situational judgment test, which is the most important part of the UCAT, even the very best students aren't scoring particularly highly in it, and the gap between the median student, so who's getting about 600, and the student who's the absolute best isn't getting 700, and that gap is smaller than we see for some of the other sections of the test. So that line is a lot less steep, for example, than the line we see for the quantitative reasoning or for the abstract reasoning, which is interesting. It's probably down to the different marking system with the situational judgment, where you can get partial marks for good but not perfect answers. But I think it's an interesting, again, a feature of what an unusual test that UCAT is. Should have planned that sentence better.
You deserve that glass of water, Matt.
Exactly, just 3 lines earlier, I would have got away with that one. So, taking all of this into account, I'm going to look at the situational judgment test in a little bit more detail. So, as I mentioned, the situational judgment test is the most important part of the test. A lot of universities won't consider you if you get a band 4, which is to say the worst of the 4 performance, the 4 quartiles. They won't consider you at all for interview. So in the situational judgment test, and I think we'll just jump back to the graph there, so we've got a visual aid. If you're in the bottom quarter of that section of the test, so that's scoring below, I would say, about 550, something along those lines. So getting the band 4 result, most universities aren't going to consider you at all. So if you've got a band 4, I would be really sort of giving up on the UCAT universities, to be honest, and really putting my energy into the BMAT, because almost no one is going to consider you with a band 4, and the places that are going to consider you, you're going to be really up against it, because there aren't going to be very many other people in your position. There are going to be people who've mostly got band 2s and band 1s. Now in the band 1 up there in the top 25%, that's going to be a real help to your course, because that is the most important part of the test. But really, as long as you are above band 4, you're still in consideration. So while it is the most important part of the test, as long as you've met that threshold, you can still be in consideration. Oh no, we've already been through that. This is why I shouldn't move around the order of the slides. The thing to remember as well is that with each answer on the SJT, you've got 4 options, and each of those is going to be ranked from best to worst. So if you don't pick the best answer, but you pick the 2nd or 3rd best answer, you still get partial credit. So that's good to know with the scoring there. And the reason so much emphasis is put on this is because the situational judgment test, much more than the other sections of the UCAT, really replicates what the work of being a doctor is like. The kinds of questions you encounter are very similar to the kinds of questions you'll encounter in MMIs when you're coming to apply and going through the interview section. And the situational judgment test is a format that is used even after you qualify as a doctor as part of placement exams. This is something that I believe we've written on, or I think maybe Rohan. It's something that we've done a little bit of looking into ourselves, and the situational judgment tests, they really stick with you as you go through medical training. So it's helpful to be good at them early on, and it is used as an important indicator. So I expect a lot of you joining us today have not necessarily done as well as they had hoped on their UCAT, and that is probably fine. There are absolutely still options open to you, whether that is putting all of your eggs into the BMAT basket, or there are plenty of universities that will consider you even with a slightly lower UCAT score. And so we're going to look through now kind of the scores that different universities are looking for. So what we see from the UCAS data that I spend basically all of my time looking at is that there is a fairly wide range of UCAT scores that will still get offers. If you haven't scored in the top 15 or 20 or 25%, that isn't necessarily the end of the world. Depending on your GCSEs, on your A-levels, if you've already done them, on your predicted grades, all of these things will still matter because the weight different universities give to the UCAT really varies. Some universities, like Manchester, will set a really high cutoff, and they will only look at students who have a really high UCAT score, whereas others, for example, Exeter, they give the UCAT roughly the same weight as your GCSEs. So if you've got great GCSEs, but your BMAT was a little mediocre, your GCSEs are going to be helping you there compensate for that. And there are some universities that barely look at the UCAT at all, or in some cases just won't tell us how they weight it. So making sure that you sort of know what you're doing on this front is really helpful when it comes to picking which universities to apply to, because what you don't want to do is to apply to a university that has a really high UCAT cutoff, a UCAT cutoff that is almost certainly going to be higher than your score, and then you've only got the 4 choices, and you've kind of wasted that one on a university that isn't going to consider you. Now, the great advantage here compared with the BMAT, which you can probably guess, is that you don't know your BMAT score yet. You won't know it until after you've submitted your application, because the test isn't until after you've submitted your application. So when it comes to making your UCAT choices, particularly if you're going for the classic 2 UCAT, 2 BMAT approach, you can make sure the 2 UCAT choices you pick are 2 that you are a really competitive applicant for, that your UCAT score compares really well with their cutoff and with their past average scores. That's a real advantage when making choices that you don't have with the BMAT. Now, we've already talked a little bit about how the BMAT might be better suited to you, so I'm not going to spend too much longer on that. What I did want to say as well is we're going to look in a moment at the different cutoff scores that different universities use. And what you will see is that there is a big variation. What I just want to reassure everyone is the cutoff being high isn't the same thing as the university being really good. It isn't the same thing as the university being really competitive. And it isn't the same thing as the standards that of the education or anything like that. They are not linked. I mean, James, we'll sort of do this a little bit of a quiz from it. What reasons do you think a university might have for setting a really high UCAT cutoff score? Why might they do that?
That is a very good question, and one that I expect you to give me the correct answer to in a moment. I imagine it's something to do with sort of how they go about the interviewing process, I suppose. Perhaps, the number of students that they want to feel capable of interviewing per year, something related to that? Yeah,
absolutely. So if you imagine you're running James University, and you have 100 students, 1,000 students applying to study medicine, and you have 100 places for them. Now, you only want 100 students, and so you want to figure out what number of students you need to interview to figure out which are the best 100. Now, one way of doing that is to do a lot of it through the test, but maybe you don't necessarily trust the test. Maybe you want to give more weight to other things, and so you might end up doing more interviews. Whereas, on the other hand, you might have more faith in the test and you might do fewer. But like you say, one of the big barriers is people. To process a lot of interviews, if you have to interview hundreds and hundreds of students, that requires dozens and dozens of people to do the interviews, to set up the arrangements for them, to record all of the scores, to keep in touch with everyone. It's a very big logistical effort to interview huge numbers of people. If you were running you and I both work for the same quite small company. We don't interview hundreds of people for each job. We normally interview 3. And that's because interviewing people is really hard work. It takes up a lot of resources. And so different universities will make different decisions about how many people they want to interview, not just because the university is good or bad, but because they might decide that the interview process is a better or worse use of their time. And this, of course, links into the number of students applying. If you've got 50 students applying for every place, you can't interview 50 students for every place. That would be mad. You can only interview in proportion to the number of applicants you've got. So what we'll see in a moment is the cutoff is a mark not just of the, not so much of the quality of the university, but of the popularity of the university. And the popularity of the university isn't necessarily linked to how good it is. It can be linked to all sorts of other factors, as we'll come on to see. I have pulled out a list here. So in last year's cycle, the cutoff score for Bristol was an enormous 2,870. So that would put you very firmly in the top 10% of people who had sat the UCAT. Bristol were only talking to people who had scored in the top 10%, which is a really high number. Edinburgh, by contrast, are coming down by fully 400 points, down to the same level as Kent. Kiel are a little bit lower than that. Manchester, sort of halfway in between. And then you've got other universities like Plymouth and Sheffield and Sunderland that are coming much more down, even into the, or even considering students who score below averagely on the UCAT. And what I've done is, because these are all big numbers, is I've made a lovely graph, which we're going to look at next, which sort of lays these out visually compared with the average UCAT scoring over the last few years. So this is my official prediction of the minimum UCAT scores to be considered for interview at each of these universities. And what you'll see is we have a big old gap here between about between roughly the average score on the UCAT and the top 75–80% on the score. There just aren't very many universities, at least that release their information, that are telling us anything there. Now, this is where I suspect a lot of universities we haven't spoken about, Exeter, King's College London, are sitting, because they are putting less weight on the UCAT and using it as part of a more holistic admissions system. And so they're not employing a UCAT cutoff at all. Now, I expect you have to be pretty good at the UCAT to get into King's, but they're not using that as a cutoff, as a hard limit. What you'll see here, and we're going to come on to talk about the popularity of different places, is that Manchester and Bristol have set very high thresholds for being considered for an interview. Now, in the case of Bristol in particular, there is a reason for this above and beyond the competitiveness of Bristol Medical School, which is that Bristol is really cool and people want to live there. The same can very much be said for Manchester. These are the two, really, apart from London, these are the two cool places to live if you are a young person, along with Brighton, which I believe is a BMAT university. These universities are setting really high UCAT thresholds, not because they are incredibly picky, not because Bristol is more difficult to get into than Cambridge, which this data very much implies. It's because loads of people want to go to Bristol. It's a cool, trendy place. And so they are getting 40, 50 applicants per place. And so in that situation, because you can't interview all of those people, what you do is you cut down really quite aggressively using the UCAT before you get into the interview process. So if you've got 50 students applying for each place and you can't realistically interview them, what Bristol will do in this situation is then cut that number down by 80 or 90% using the UCAT scoring, so that they have a manageable number of people to figure out who to interview. Now, down at the other end of the scale, we have universities that are putting much more emphasis on GCSEs, on work experience. We have universities that are less insanely popular than Bristol or Manchester, that are setting lower UCAT cutoffs. Now, being above the cutoff doesn't guarantee you an interview, but it does mean that you are in with a shot of getting one. And so you can see here that Kiel and Sunderland, for example, are happy to consider almost everyone who applies, because they're setting a really low floor on the UCAT. They're saying they want people to do it, but that they're not super interested in your UCAT score. And we see something similar from Queen Mary as well. I think what's interesting here to add is that we see that Edinburgh, which is setting its UCAT cutoff at around 2470, Edinburgh is, in terms of rankings, just as good a university as Manchester or Bristol, perhaps above one or two of those, certainly, I think, traditionally above Newcastle in the rankings. And so these cutoff scores aren't an evidence of the university's quality or reputation or anything like that. It really is a subjective choice the university is making about how to run its admissions process. And what Edinburgh has decided to do is they want to devote more resources to interviewing. They want to put more emphasis on GCSEs, on personal statements, on work experience. They're happy to have a bigger, more holistic process than other universities that are keen to use the UCAT to make the rest of the admissions process easier. So you look at that, Edinburgh are interested in anyone who's in the top half of the UCAT, whereas Bristol are only worried about the top 10%. And that's not because these students in that gap in between aren't good enough for Bristol. It is just a choice that is being made about how to operate the admissions process. So I hope that's reassuring for everyone who was sort of worried on that count. And of course, it means if you've got a really spectacular UCAT score, then you can make a really informed decision about some of these higher ranking places as well. If you have scored, I don't know, 3,100 on the UCAT, which, can you score that high? I'm not sure. Then applying for Bristol, where you know that you're already above the cutoff, and so you're going to be competing with only 4 or 5 people per place, rather than the 10 or 20 it might be at Edinburgh or Kent, that might be a smarter decision for you. So what a lot of lovely slides. I'm just going to try and draw this to an end before I hand over to James for a little bit. The last thing I want to add here is, wherever you go to medical school, you are a real doctor. I myself go to the hospital sometimes. Not once has it occurred to me when I'm receiving medical treatment to ask the doctor where they were trained, and if it was Kiel, go, no, actually, I'd rather not. I'm not convinced. I'm not sure you're a proper doctor. Is there not anyone who went to King's here? And they'd go, no. And I go, well, it's fine. I'll just die instead then. Regardless of where you go, you will be a real doctor. The difference in the quality of training is basically non-existent. The difference in the career opportunities it opens up for you, also very close to being non-existent. You will still be a real doctor. Don't worry about the prestige of the medical school you are going to. Every year we have students who speak to us in March and April, and they will say, I applied to Oxford and to UCL and to King's and to Kent, and I only got into Kent. Should I apply for medical school again? And we say, no, that's a terrible idea. You got into medical school, you can become a doctor. Don't go through this whole process again and run the risk of not having the opportunity at all, just because you don't feel that it's a sufficiently prestigious university. It really doesn't matter from the standpoint of the quality of medical education. You will still be a real doctor. To add to that, as we've mentioned, some universities will consider you even with a relatively low UCAT score. That's not because they're not looking to get people who are smart. It's because they think they are putting less weight on the test. They are more interested in other factors like the GCSE, like the interview. And this goes right across the board. We've not talked about Exeter or King's or a whole bunch of other universities that, while they ask for the BMAT, they don't employ a cutoff score. They're not totally transparent about how they use the UCAT. And that's because, again, they like the UCAT, but not so much that they want it to dictate their admissions process. So don't let a UCAT score put you off entirely from some of these places. And last of all, if the UCAT has gone badly, but particularly if you've done well in the quantitative and the verbal reasoning section, really consider whether you want to put all of your eggs in that BMAT basket. Maybe going for 3 BMAT universities and 1 UCAT, maybe even 4 BMATs, although I wouldn't generally recommend that. But if you think the problem with the UCAT was the UCAT rather than the U, then, really put that emphasis on the BMAT. If you think that's a better exam for you, then that is absolutely fine. As we mentioned earlier, I personally find the BMAT much easier when I practice these. Not because I'm trying to get into medical school, but because I don't like the idea of, teaching these exams without being any good at them. And I do pretty well on the BMAT, but I'm not very good at the UCAT. Fortunately, I'm not trying to become a doctor, but if I were applying, I would very much be focusing on the BMAT universities rather than the UCAT ones, because I know that the UCAT is not my strength. Now, speaking of all of the support and teaching and things that we provide, although not to me, which is probably why I'm not very good at the UCAT, I'm going to hand over to James to talk a little bit about the support that we offer here at UniAdmissions.
Perfect. Yeah, I thought that was excellent, Matt, actually, very, very thorough. And I would say, in fact, if you kind of want an even more sort of exhaustive and comprehensive sort of list of, universities, how they use the UCAT, all of those sorts of things, cutoffs, do have a look at our website, because the team have written some excellent articles that sort of break down every single UCAT university, if they have a cutoff, but all of those sorts of things. So do check them out as well, because it's sometimes easy to be overwhelmed by the data, isn't it? Well, if you didn't know already, we're a preparation school, so we support students applying for medicine, and we have programs to help students sort of prepare effectively and ultimately get offers. It's something we do very well at, actually, for medicine. I mean, for the UCAT universities, over the last 5 years, I think it's been upwards of 70%, Matt, of our students who've received offers. So we do very, very well. Obviously, if you've taken the UCAT and your score isn't very good, you really have to take the BMAT. I would argue that even if you've taken the UCAT and your score is very good, it's still worthwhile taking the BMAT. Just gives you an overall sort of greater strategic chance of getting an offer. What we do is we prepare students, and we have a program. There are generally sort of 4 parts to these kinds of programs. Firstly, it's one-to-one tuition. So working with a tutor who's been through the same process themselves. So working with a tutor on preparing for the BMAT. I'm sure we're going to go into this when we look at the BMAT. The BMAT is a test with it's a bit of a geeky test. I like to think there are lots of sort of hidden rewards within it. It's something where if you have an understanding of the sort of strategy behind the test, you can do very well. Things like pattern recognition. So working with a tutor helps you to sort of prepare effectively for the test, and then also sort of prepare for the interviews, work through the mechanics of the interviews, and help you to develop and refine your personal statement as well. So we have one-to-one tuition. Alongside one-to-one tuition, we have resources. So we've actually published quite a large number, many of which are award-winning books for the medicine applications. You can have a look on Amazon, actually, to look at those in a little bit more detail. But as part of a program, you work through quite a structured syllabus of learning towards the tests and the interviews. I think what oftentimes students don't do very well in the preparation for these tests is they will just bang their head against a wall doing question banks. They will just do exhaustive question banks until they literally can't focus anymore. But I think the problem with that is if you don't have more than just question banks, you don't really ever get to identify where you're going wrong. If you're making the same mistakes over and over again, you don't really get that input. So anyway, you work through a syllabus of materials towards the tests, personal statements and interviews, using all of the materials and resources that we have. Alongside all of those things, we also have weekly enrichment seminars. So in this context of medicine, we have weekly medicine enrichment seminars where we look at different topics within medicine each week, really building towards your interviews. The mistake a lot of students will make each year when they apply for medicine is that they will do lots of reading, but they'll never actually practice discussing what they've read. And so when they get into an interview scenario and they're actually required to do that, it's not something that they've ever actually verbalized. They might have had lots of kind of conversations in their head about what they've read, but when you're actually having to discuss it, it's a different thing entirely. So those weekly seminars are just building your confidence and competence in discussing areas of medicine. So those are weekly. And then finally, we have some intensive courses as well. So again, in the context of medicine, you have the BMAT coming up, but then beyond that, interviews. So we consolidate the learning that our students have done through our programs and provide a sort of final springboard into the test, into the interviews. And that's generally the structure of what a program looks like. However, what I should say is we are a selective preparation school. And what we do is have a conversation with the students and parents, and actually through a process of sort of exploring your application, determine what we see would make a tangible difference in your chances of getting an offer, and recommend some kind of support that would get you over the line, essentially. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, do get in contact with us and we can have that chat. And even if it doesn't lead to joining a program, I'm sure we'll be able to sort of help with some advice and guidance, along the way anyway. Over to you again, Matt.
Fab. Thanks so much, James. Couldn't have put it better myself, which is why I get you to do it. As I think James mentioned earlier, we're in the very fortunate position that all of this stuff seems to work. We have really enviable success rates that we're really proud of, not just for medicine, but also for students applying to Oxford and Cambridge. But we very much think of medicine as being our bread and butter, and it's something that we're really proud of in terms of our performance, both with home and with international students, which is something I want to talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. As I mentioned, we're very proud of what we do. Our success rates compare with even some of the fanciest and most expensive schools. So, why go to Eton when you could come to us? Beyond the snazzy outfits, they're very snazzy outfits, and we really. Well, James got a stripy shirt on. That's something. It's not quite as snazzy as they get at Eton, but it's something. If you've enjoyed this webinar, which I hope you have, please do leave us a nice review on Trustpilot. I've been asking this for every week for the last few weeks, and as yet no one has written a review specifically mentioning myself, my good looks, my charm, my incredible intellect. If you would like to write a review like that, or even one that's true, please do that, and I will add it to this and all future presentations, and say something nice about you, just as you've done about me. So please do that for your chance to become a part of the regular UniAdmissions weekly webinar.
I think your graphs alone are worthy of a positive review, aren't they, Matt?
Oh,
particularly that last one that somehow resembled a stick insect. I don't know if anybody else just had an image of a stick insect in their mind. Perhaps not.
So that's more of a zoology sort of thing. I'm sticking to medicine. I was thinking of someone's spine that's gone really wrong.
Okay, that's probably why neither of us are medics, Matt.
Yes, same here. You can also listen to our podcast, which is with our founder Rohan and my colleague Will. They tackle all sorts of questions, not just university admissions, but I believe they did an episode on the zombie apocalypse and how they would approach that. So all kinds of problem solving from those guys. Speaking of problem solving, I'm now going to attempt to answer some of your questions, and hopefully I'm going to be able to play a little video. No, I'm not. Apparently that doesn't work today. What you can do is you can visit uniadmissions.co.uk/booking to arrange a consultation with James or one of his colleagues. Normally there would be a video here, but today it does not work. We will have to hope that you are all so smart that you do not need a video showing you how to visit that web address. I'm sure you are. It just makes the whole next bit a little less visually engaging. So let us have a look at some questions. I'm going to start off by talking about international students because I've actually got a good answer all around here. Yakub asks, as an international student, I assume that the thresholds are automatically higher. Should I simply add 20 to 40 points to the home student cutoffs to get more realistic expectations? How does that sound to you, James?
Well, I mean, the reality is it's very, very competitive for an international, but I don't think they're actually published differences in cutoffs, are there? Or perhaps you're going to tell me there are.
Not that I've seen, although that may be for a want of looking rather than a genuine absence. But yeah, I would say adding 20 or 40 points to the home student cutoff is a good start. Unfortunately, as James mentions, there are fairly strict limits on the number of overseas students that are able to study medicine in the UK each year. So inevitably, it is going to be more competitive because there are simply fewer places available. It's something I would like to get better data on, but I don't have anything better available at the moment. So I would say if you are figuring out where to apply as an international student, take a look at your UCAT score and then compare that with, look a little bit lower down the cutoff scores we've been looking at, so that you've got a better chance of meeting that probably higher cutoff they're setting for international students. But without more data, it's difficult to be absolutely precise. I know that we had a couple of successful international medics last year, and I believe in terms of their BMAT scores, they were scoring something like 7.2, which is a really impressive BMAT score. And I would have to have a look at the UCAT scores as well. But we would expect that to be a competitive international applicant, you would want to be getting a really nice high score if you possibly can. If you've got particular questions based on your personal circumstances about your score, about your school grades, what should they do, James?
Well, I mean, get in contact with us, certainly. I would really encourage you guys to have a look at the website as well. There really is an article that breaks this down so clearly and answers a lot of these questions. I appreciate, it's hard to know exactly where to apply to with a particular score, but the more well-informed you are, the easier you can make that decision. So do have a look at the website. There's a really good UCAT scoring article on there.
Right. We've had a couple of questions about students who have got high UCAT scores but have done less well on the situational judgment test. Now, if you're an international applicant, it may be that the situation here is that you're less familiar with the question style of the SJT. Perhaps English may not be your first language. Perhaps the UK kind of cultural context is a little more difficult to you. In this situation, I think that you can feel slightly more confident about the SJT here, because the universities are going to be able to see what it is that's happened here. They're going to see that you're really good at all of the technical skills that are being tested in the other parts, but that the more intensive language section in the SJT has been perhaps more of a challenge. Now, I think they're going to probably, in most cases, understand what's happened there. And so I wouldn't worry enormously about it, but I would be looking at universities that put less emphasis on the situational judgment test and more emphasis on the question scoring. Again, I think this is something that should be covered in the article on the website, James.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But again, this is the interesting thing about the UCAT, that different universities will weight different parts of it, and they will weight it in different ways compared with GCSE. So it's a really good case to do your research. But as in a couple of cases here, I can see people are mentioning that they've scored around 2,800. Those are really good scores on the UCAT. So if you apply somewhere that's putting less emphasis on the SJT, then I think that should be absolutely fine. And of course, if you're coming to look at the BMAT in a few weeks' time, while you still have the essay component of the BMAT, which has a certain amount of crossover with the SJT, the weighting of the essay section of the BMAT tends to be relatively low, certainly lower than the SJT is for the UCAT. So the BMAT may be a better bet for you in terms of compensating for that. Let's have a look.
I should also say, maybe the universities won't be very happy with me suggesting this, but there is actually no reason why you can't contact medical schools directly to inquire about these things. They may not be able to give you an exact answer on your specific circumstances, but they will give you, or I'm led to believe they're pretty open to give you their own the way that they use the UCAT, should I say. So, and if you've got some options, there's nothing against you contacting them and actually asking them the question. It's not going to be to the detriment of your application. They're not going to keep your name on file, and blacklist you. Just contact them and ask. Absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do that. It may be a little while to get a response, I don't know, but do it after this open day and you'll get an answer before the 15th, certainly.
Yes, definitely. James is absolutely right. The universities, this isn't a secret. They will answer your questions to the best of their ability. And for the most part, the people who answer the questions and the people who make the decisions on admissions are completely different groups of people. They don't, like James says, keep a special file on you. There isn't any kind of conspiracy at work. They'll be doing their very best to give you the best information. It's not as not as secretive as all that. Anna asked about finding these criteria. Again, it's always best to have a look at the university of the website that you're specifically applying to. We do our very best to keep all of our information as up to date as we can, but of course we will never be as up to date as the person who is running the actual university. They're always the experts on how they do things. So I would absolutely recommend having a look at those websites and making sure that you have a clear sense of what you need to do for each university you're applying to. We've got a few people dropping in various scores. Some of these seem like excellent scores. Very well done. Particularly to Kao, excellent scores. Very well done. We'd love to have a conversation with you and figure out where we can sort of best target you, because that's a fantastic Ucat score. The same for who else had it? Somebody else thrown in? I think that's the one. Anyway, some marvelous scores out there, so you should be very competitive with those. And again, if you haven't done quite as well on the SJT, if that's down to a language issue, then universities are going to understand what's going on there. James has just passed on to me the article about which answers a lot of the questions that you've mentioned, which I'm just dropping into the chat now. So if you want to click through to that, that'll give you a lot more information about how universities are applying the Ucat, how they're weighting it with other things, the SJT, all those sorts of questions, because I appreciate they're coming up a lot, but I'm not going to try and just read out the article because I'll get things wrong because I can't remember it all. Olasei has an absolutely spectacular Ucat score.
Yeah.
And they ask about the situation with work experience. So obviously it being the middle of September now, it's a little bit late to change the amount of work experience you've got. So I would just going to give some general advice on work experience, which is if you've been able to get some, that's really wonderful and is really helpful. The place for that work experience is primarily in your personal statement to really make clear why it is you want to be a doctor, to really work through and sort of explore your motivation, to show that you have, double checked essentially to make sure that it really is the right thing for you. But given the situation with the global health, over the past couple of years, there is going to be less emphasis on work experience. No one's going to be expecting you to have spent 8 weeks in a hospital when no one's been allowed to spend that long in a hospital if they don't genuinely work there, or are very ill, I suppose. I wonder if being very ill counts as work experience.
Well, actually, there's an interesting point because a lot of people get really, really caught up on the work experience, but you're not evidencing the work experience that you've done. So, the fact that you might have done, sort of a year of work experience or 3 days of work experience, actually, it's not really relevant. What is important is you have an ability to discuss what you've done and reflect on the work experience that you've done in the context of wanting to be a medic, of wanting to study medicine. If you've done 10 weeks of work experience and you're asked about it and you just have nothing to say, then actually the work experience is irrelevant. So that's important. They don't have a cutoff, based on the number of days of work experience that you've done, like they do the Ucat. So I wouldn't get too hung up on your work experience. As long as you can reflect on it, as long as you can talk about why it was useful for you, then that's fine. I mean, I think Rohan was telling me recently, there have been students who've received offers with sort of 3 days of work experience. We don't have to do weeks and weeks of it. And again, that's not the point. It's about what did you learn from it. Sorry for that.
No, I think that's absolutely spot on. The way I tend to talk about work experience is sort of the other way round, which is to say, it's really easy to think you want to do something until you try it. And so one of the real values of work experience is double checking you do want to be a doctor. I've met people in the past who didn't find out that they would faint at the sight of blood until they arrived at medical school, at which point they had very much to leave medical school because it wasn't going to work. So much of work experience is finding out whether you want to do a job. And so the important part, like James says there, is the reflection. If you've had a few weeks, a few days worth of work experience, the most valuable thing you can do with that work experience now is spend time discussing it, spend time writing about it, spend time really working through in your mind what you got out of it, so that when someone asks you, you have something really interesting and insightful to say about it. The worst thing you could do is do loads of work experience and never reflect on it, because then you wouldn't be able to explain to me why it was interesting. So I would say, don't worry about getting work experience now, but if you can, if you were able to write reconstruct a diary, write down some key points, some anecdotes, things you've learned, turn your work experience into a short story. I don't know. Come up with some kind of way of practicing talking about it, of reflecting on it, so that when someone comes to ask you about that experience you've had, you have something that's really interesting to say. Because, that's what's going to count. It isn't about ticking a box or hitting a certain number of days, as James said. It's about being able to demonstrate that you are a good potential doctor. And that is about reflection and consideration and all those sort of doctorly skills. Because, thinking about it, when you become a doctor, you're going to have more than enough time to practice being a doctor. What you're not going to have necessarily is the time to make sure to reflect on your practice. You want to get that in early. Now, we haven't dealt with as many questions as I would have liked. We have a lot of questions that are really the kind of ones I would like to tackle one-to-one. There's a lot of questions about people's personal circumstances. So for those, really do book in a consultation with James or one of our colleagues, so that we can have a proper conversation and figure out what we can do for you. Because particularly for international applicants, it is a little bit more complicated as a process, getting together all of the information to make an informed recommendation. And it's not something I want to do here, because I will do it wrong and it will be embarrassing. So I think we'll call it a day there. It's just coming up for 3 o'clock. Out of respect for Her late Majesty, there is no football, so I don't have that excuse. So I'm just going to say it's because I want to go to the shops, because there's an enormous black cloud approaching out of the window, and I don't want to get wet because I lost my umbrella in London over the last week. So all that remains to say is thank you so much for joining me, James.
Oh, been a pleasure.
And we'll be back, maybe with James, maybe with Rohan, who knows with who, next week to do some sort of mock interviews, which I'm very excited about, unless it's me who's being asked the questions, in which case I'm very afraid. So have a lovely weekend, everyone, and we will see you then. Goodbye.
Bye.